So it's lovely to be with you, and we're going to be going through a real whistle-stop tour over psychological trauma this morning. We will have space for questions, and I have got the bottom of the slide here, my website, which has got an email address on it as well. So if you've got any questions you want to get in touch afterwards, more than welcome. So what we're going to have a quick kind of whiz through is looking at what psychological trauma actually is, how it might show up in the body and the mind, and some things that we can do to help. So just a note to say that what we're going to be talking about when we talk about psychological trauma, it can be difficult. You know, we're really actively focusing in on difficult topics, and so that might be tricky to listen to. So it's just an invitation to be really gentle and kind with yourself when we're going through this session. If you need to stop and pause and come back to it later, you know, that's totally fine. So just that everyone takes responsibility just to look after themselves with that. So if we just have a think about what is psychological trauma, you know, it would be helpful if anyone wants to put in the chat. I know there's a lot of people, but just these questions that I've got here. What do you think it is? What do you think causes it? And how do you think it might show up? If you want to just put in the chat, maybe any kind of answers to that. By the way, there's no right or wrong answers here. Yeah, so it's not like a quiz, but I'm just interested to see what you all think. So not sleeping, having nightmares and anxiety, nervous system not working. Yeah, so life-changing event causes it, absolutely. So shock diagnosis. So this used to be after the First World War, people used to call kind of these responses shell shock. So it's the same, essentially the same thing. Yeah, feeling overwhelmed, helplessness, flashbacks. Yeah. Yeah, and I think that's really interesting, Val. Thank you for saying that. So that it kicked in when treatment ended. It's really common that when you're going through a really difficult period, we kind of hold it, and we hold on and hold on and hold on and hold on because we just need to get through. And then when that's finished, whatever that episode period time is, then when it's finished, then it's kind of, then we realize the severity, the gravity, the enormity of whatever it is has happened. And that's when we can kind of feel it. Yeah, fear of the future, struggling with everyday life. Yeah. So there's a lot of fear. So if we have a little bit of a think, if we park all of that for a moment and park the idea of, you know, originally how we've met, as in that this is through cancer. So just park all of that for a moment and just think about what happens in our body. So what are normal physiological responses? So if we are in some kind of threat, so if you imagine, if we, you know, we're all animals, if you think about this gazelle and it's clearly having a threat to its life. And if there is a threat, and either an actual threat or a perceived threat. And that's really important to just distinguish that. So the brain doesn't distinguish if something is actually happening or if there is a fear or a perception that it's about to happen. So if there's an actual or perceived threat, then the body just kicks into survival mode. And this threat is picked up not by the thinking brain, not by this really big thinking brain. It's picked up by the limbic system, which is kind of deep embedded in the brain. And it's a more primitive part, evolutionary wise, a much more primitive part of the brain. And that primitive part of the brain kicks in a split second before our thinking brain. So it's not that our brain kind of goes, oh, I think there's a bit of danger, need to kind of do some stuff so that we're going to be okay. It's that there's this complete with the sensory, with the senses, so with your sight, sound, smell, taste, and that kind of feeling that there's some kind of impending danger kicks into a survival response, and the body goes through a catalogue of events. So what happens is that the body then starts to go into this survival mode of releasing. So we're just going to kind of put all of these things up. So it increases the heart rate. You'll start breathing faster. All of the big muscles get kind of primed. All the senses are on hyper alert. And that's all. If you think, so most of you will have heard about the fight flight response. People kind of talk about that fight flight. So it's getting ready and the body's kind of primed to either fight or to flee. There are other responses and we'll talk about those in a minute. But if you just kind of think about that, the body's just kind of getting ready and primed. And your immune system gets primed. And if you think, if you think back to that gazelle, if the lion jumps on it and scratches it, the claws aren't exactly going to be clean. So if there's a break to the skin, there is a risk of infection coming in. So to make sure that the body has the biggest chance of survival, it's all about survival, the immune system kind of gets turned on and primed. The clotting system gets primed so that if there is a cut to the skin, if there is a bleed, it can stop quickly. Lots more blood sugar is released so that if there is like a need to fight or flee, you're using up more energy. So you're going to need to have more energy in the form of blood sugar in the body. And because all of this is going on for survival, blood gets diverted to those areas of the body that are needed for survival, like the heart, the lungs, and those big muscles, and away from the areas that are not needed for survival. So digesting food, reproductive system, not important when you're being chased by a lion. So those areas, so the gut and the reproductive system, like genital urinary system, that all gets switched off. All of this is all just about survival. That is the only thing, is that it's about survival. So I like to have kind of things in images and pictures. So kind of thinking about it like in a cycle. So you have an actual or perceived threat. You have this survival response that's mediated by that primitive part of the brain. You have the hormone cascade of, lots of cortisol and adrenaline flooding the system. Then you have these physiological and behavioral responses like we've just talked about. And then either, if you think about it in terms of the animals, either they die, like the lion gets it, or they survive. And if they survive, what the animals do is they shake off the excess adrenaline. And you can see that in kind of David Attenborough shows. You can look this up on YouTube and you'll see animals literally standing there and shaking. And what that shaking does is it brings the body back to balance, brings it back to homeostasis, and then it's kind of ready for the next, whatever happens. So this stress response, this survival response, the point is it's there. There's a threat, it kicks in and it comes back to neutral. Kicks in, comes back to neutral. So it's there to keep us alive. So what can happen is, again, like I've said, all of these things, actual perceived threat, the stress cascade gets turned on, and then animals tend to shake, and that discharges the stress. We don't do that. So when we get that real kind of adrenaline overwhelm, flooding, we don't do that. We hold in all of this emotion and we suppress it. So if you think of like an example where you've gone shopping, you've got your arms full of you've just bought like some really beautiful bowl that's like made out of glass, and you're carrying it and you're thinking in your mind where you're going to place it. Are you going to be able to put some flowers in it so that it really kind of sets off the light, and think about where you can place it, maybe near the window, and you're kind of not really paying attention to what's going on, and you're about to step out on the road and a motorbike appears out of nowhere. And your survival response kicks in and you jump back and drop what you're holding. Now, rather than standing there and thinking, oh my goodness, I just nearly got hit by a motorbike, and being aware of all the adrenaline coursing through your system and standing there and thinking, okay, I'm just going to stand here and shake it all off so that, you know, my body can kind of recover and discharge that adrenaline. We don't do that. We kind of think, oh gosh, that's so embarrassing. I can't believe I just did that. I didn't notice the bike. I've now smashed my bowl. What we tend to do is to quickly gather things up and scuttle away and hope that no one noticed. And then try and think about it only when we've got home, if we think about it at all. And sometimes the brain and body don't recognize the traumatic event as being over, and it can partially remain kind of stuck in that survival mode. So just before I come on to those bits. So what can happen is when the brain and body get partially stuck, that rather than that acute response and it comes back to neutral, there's a response and it doesn't quite come back. It's not quite as on as that full-on acute response, but it doesn't quite come back to neutral. So it kind of is going like this rather than coming straight back down. And that stuckness, that's then when we can start to develop symptoms. That's when we can start to develop problems. So if we just have a little bit of a think about these, that there are other survival responses. So fight, flight, people tend to have heard of. So it's in that moment where that threat is perceived, the brain will just, that primitive part of the brain will just assess the situation in that split second, relate it to previous knowledge, prior experience, prior lived experience, and go down a course of action for survival. This is not a conscious thought of, which one shall I choose today? Which one do I feel like? Which one looks better? It's nothing like that. It's literally about survival. So these responses, there's no hierarchy with them. They're just there to help you survive. So if we just go through them a little bit, fight, flight's pretty obvious. Freeze is if you think about, like, if you're driving at night and you see like a rabbit in the headlights or deer in the headlights, where they just stand completely still and just don't move. So the reason why that's a brilliant way to survive, most predators track their prey with movement. So if the prey then stops still, it may be that the predator thinks it's a big rock or a bush and leaves it. So brilliant way to survive. The flop response, what can happen is, if you think back to that image of the gazelle and the lion, that just as the lion's pouncing, and it may just graze the gazelle, that the gazelle just flops down as if it's dead. The reason why that's a brilliant response is that most predators want a fresh kill, so they know it's not diseased. So they might then just leave it if they think it's just dropped down dead and they haven't actually killed it. Or if they have kind of grazed it and they kind of think they've killed it, but actually they haven't, they might just, thinking it's dead, pull it behind a bush or a rock or something and go off and get their young. And in that moment when the predator's gone, the prey can get up and escape. And fawn is the response of submission. So it's where the survival response is to just go along with whatever's happening so that hopefully it will pass and then you can get to survival. So the brain has just assessed the situation that there's no way of getting out, that hopefully it will pass. So just to go along with it and then to get away. So just to reiterate, there is no hierarchy with these. It's not that one's better than the other, that one shows you're more resilient or stronger. They are all just ways to survive. And that even with the same kind of trigger, people, so if there is a repeated situation, people may respond in different ways on a different day to the same kind of the same scenario. And that's because every day is slightly different. So it may be the same scenario, but how we're feeling, what's around us is always very slightly different. And just a note to say that young children don't have that option really of a fight-flight response. because they're so small. So young children, their responses only are freeze, flop, fawn. So actually, when we think about psychological trauma, it's actually a normal response to an abnormal situation. So all the brain and the body are doing are going into a survival response. It's a completely normal response to an abnormal situation. It's not that the brain's doing something wrong or doing something weird. It's completely normal what it's doing, and it's there so that to try and get to survival. Now, when these things start to become a problem, it's like when we were saying earlier that it's not that response hasn't been switched off properly. So if it happening is not the problem, but it getting switched off properly and coming back to neutral, that's when things start to become difficult. So if you think that it's normal for the heart rate to increase and breathing to become kind of shallow and fast, however, if that doesn't get switched off properly, to end up having palpitations and breathing difficulties, higher increase of asthma, that tends to happen. For the muscles to kind of get primed and tensed up for that readiness to be ready for that fight-flight response, that's a totally normal response. But if that doesn't go away, then that tension can lead to tension headaches and back and neck pain, chronic pain, even fibromyalgia. And if the gut's not important for survival, but if that doesn't get switched back on again, then the digestive system is never fully kind of back on track. So digestion will always be slowed, and there can be a really big overlap with things like IBS and bloating and gut symptoms. It does all depend on also what's really important to note as a kind of an overlap with this is the sense of safety that someone feels. So it's not to say that whenever there is a traumatic experience or traumatic event, therefore there will be consequences, that there is a survival response that will happen, but that it lingers, that doesn't always happen. That there's consequences, that doesn't always happen. So it's dependent very much on the surroundings and the context of what's going on. So how safe somebody might feel in general in their whole life, what previous experiences are there, what's going on, what's in that environment of when that event is happening, how intense is it, how long is it going on for. So all of those things play a part on whether these kind of maladaptive when these symptoms, when these responses that are normal responses become maladaptive or become a problem. So if we just think about definitions really quickly, these are kind of like official definitions. And so within medicine, within psychiatry, we have to kind of, for diagnoses, follow criteria for kind of diagnosing people. Now, an acute stress reaction is something that lasts under 4 weeks. I mean, I'm just saying these are official definitions, yeah? You cannot diagnose post-traumatic stress disorder or PTSD until it's over 4 weeks ago since something happened. PTSD tends to be from a big event. Complex PTSD tends to be from things that are more insidious and ongoing. So things that are lasting more a long time and repeated ongoing triggers. And that has much more of an impact on someone's self-worth, ability to trust and form relationships. And then there's things like burnout, compassion fatigue, and secondary traumatic stress. So these last ones, vicarious trauma and compassion fatigue and secondary traumatic stress, they're very much for to be mindful of. They're basically what they're to do with is when someone is bearing witness to another individual's traumatic event or traumatic response. So they haven't gone through the event themselves, but they're bearing witness to someone else. So that can be a therapist who's hearing things over and over, or a frontline worker. It can be somebody who's caring or living with somebody who is going through something very difficult. So it's just to kind of be mindful of how we can absorb and be affected by being very close to either personally or working with people who are going through very difficult situations. So if we think about how this might manifest medically, you know, if we think kind of in a purely medical sense, there's a huge overlap with mental health issues. So things like anxiety, depression, EUPD stands for emotionally unstable personality disorder or borderline personality disorder, insomnia, that kind of cognitive, you know, really struggling to make decisions, kind of brain fog. Things, as I've mentioned before, chronic pain, fibromyalgia, irritable bowel syndrome, severe pelvic pain. There's also big overlap with autoimmune conditions. So if you think one of the things that we said gets turned off or gets primed in that stress response is the immune system. But if that's then constantly primed and not fully switched off back to neutral, that's much more kind of hypersensitive to triggers. And so there is an increased risk of things like autoimmune conditions starting to develop. Functional neurological conditions is just kind of an umbrella where essentially doctors don't really know what's going on, that are more to do with kind of nerve issues. And for me, it's something that is a real kind of something to note. If I see somebody who is essentially fit and relatively young, but has multiple medical issues, or is seeing multiple specialists, that to me is always then a bit of a actually, what's underlying this? Is there something? Is there a trauma response underlying this? And then if we think about behavior, so it's not just the physical, it's what then happens in behavior. It's that constant living in a state of fear and a real extreme lack of self-worth. Shame is something that is really, really prevalent, particularly in complex PTSD. So it's that real, so these are symptoms that really are more tend to be with complex PTSD. And you know, that feeling overwhelmed. So the things that were kind of mentioned earlier, some things that we tend not to notice are the issues with struggling with boundaries. So personal boundaries of saying no, actually I don't want to do that, or I don't want to go to that place, or today I don't want to see that person. And being really, really busy. So filling the day, filling our lives, filling our schedules so much that we don't have to feel. There can also be this, at the same time, knowing that change is really important, knowing that wanting to change is really, really important, and actually really wanting that. It's not just an idea of like, yeah, I really ought to change, but like really, no, I really want to do this. But at the same time, being really fearful because change is unknown, and that unknown can be really frightening. So even if a situation is a very bad, difficult situation, it's known, and there is a sense of control in that. And so changing to something else when it's unknown can be really fearful or fear-inducing. So again, it's just to reiterate that these responses, all of these responses and these responses, they all started out as normal responses to an abnormal event. but they've stayed. And so it's that thing that they've kind of stayed in the body. And by body, I kind of mean, you know, body and mind. And because of that, it starts then to cause symptoms and dis-ease or disease in the body. So it's that point of thinking an acute stress response. So that stress cycle that we talked about originally, that acute stress response, that's really important. That's why we're all here. If we didn't have that, well, we wouldn't have survived. We wouldn't be alive. We wouldn't be here. But it's the chronic stress that becomes the problem. So if that acute stress response doesn't come back down, if it doesn't get switched off, if it doesn't come back to neutral, that leads to chronic stress in the body. And when we have chronic stress in the body, that can lead to inflammation. And inflammation both in, you know, throughout the body. So think of it as neuroinflammation, so to do with the brain, as well as inflammation throughout the body. And what does that look like? What we've said already. So in the body, that can be anything from pain to autoimmune conditions to gut issues. And with neuroinflammation, it may be anxiety, it may be insomnia, it may be depression. So there's a massive link between how all of the brain and the body work. So we used to think that most of the information kind of comes from the brain, kind of controls the body. But actually it's about 70 to 80% of the signaling from the nerves actually goes from the body up to the brain. So the body is sensing, feeling what's going on and sending information up to the brain. So if there's inflammation in the gut, and the gut has, again, about 70, 80% of our immune system. So if our immune system in our gut is all kind of triggered and inflamed and there's kind of stuff going on, all of that information is going up into the brain. And that in itself can cause then anxiety, depression, insomnia. And if we're feeling really anxious, that can then also have an impact on the gut. And so we start to get gut symptoms as well. So we cannot take this off. They are so interlinked. And research now is just showing, you know, how interlinked they are. And that means that there's a lot that we can do about it. So if we think about what we can do, all of the things that we're trying to do that can help are all about reducing inflammation. And it may seem like they're really simple things. And that's, they don't sound, you know, they're not like really snazzy and exciting, but it's the simple things that just really make the difference. So really prioritizing sleep, really looking at a sleep, like the way that we phrase it, sleep hygiene. So really looking at how do we do that? So, you know, looking at good sleep, it starts in the morning when we get up, getting some blue light. So making sure that we see daylight. So the backs of our eyes see daylight without sunglasses for about 15 minutes in the day. That helps set our circadian rhythm or our body clock so that we can then find it easier to fall asleep in the evening. Trying to minimize processed food and sugar has a huge impact on the gut. There's a whole heap more. I'm sure there's lots of resources within Penny Bron around this. Drinking lots of water. So those are like really looking at kind of the physical health things. But then there's all of the other things that were in that wheel that Zena was talking about at the start. That being in nature, you know, there's things in nature, just being in nature, that really helps calm the mind and calm the nervous system. Really looking at being around people that make you feel like make you feel okay. Really, really, really important. Things like play, you know, not doing something because it's healthy or because someone told you that you ought to do it, or to learn more for a qualification or anything like that. It's just doing it just because it's fun, just because when you do it, it makes you just feel joy. Doing something creative, again, similar reasons. They're often the things that we dismiss because they don't seem like real in some way. They have hugely powerful impacts on our body. And this idea of completing the stress cycle. So completing the stress cycle can be anything. So it can be that you do things like, I mean, you can literally kind of just stand there and shake. It can be punching a load of pillows. It can be screaming into a towel and kind of gently holding a towel or a cloth over your voice box and then screaming into a towel. Kind of that helps protect your voice box a bit. Or parking your car somewhere a little bit quiet and having windows shut and screaming then. People you can't really hear much when the windows are shut. That's kind of my favourite thing to do. Putting on the radio, dancing around your kitchen, but it's not like kind of, cool, trendy dancing. It's like going for it. So you're really physically moving the body, maybe going for a run, but maybe if you're feeling really exhausted, it can just be literally like lying in the bed and punching and kicking the bed. So there's ways of doing it for kind of all abilities. So it's thinking about that repressed emotion that we tend to do as humans. That's not good. We need to somehow let it out. How we let it out, that will change person to person, what feels right. So we don't need to tap into it all and let it all out at once, but just little bits at a time that feel safe. So if you think in terms of, if you think of a Coke bottle, like a fizzy drink bottle, and if you shake it, if you take the lid off, it kind of explodes and makes a mess everywhere. But what you can do is just loosen the lid a bit and lets a little bit of fizz out, and then you can just tighten it up. And then when you're ready, loosen it a little bit and then tighten it up again. That's what I invite you to do. So just like kind of 5 minutes a day of just tapping into whatever emotions there, rage, grief, bitterness, letting it out, and then it's okay to kind of put it away again. It's not that we need to do it all at the same time. And I meant to kind of say this earlier, but I wanted just to mention, just to say that all of these things reduce inflammation. So it's all about reducing inflammation in the nervous system and in the body. A quick but a kind of important point about all of the definitions that I meant to say earlier. The official medical definitions are all, is it PTSD? Is it not PTSD? Is it, and a lot of like official medical definitions don't even recognize complex PTSD yet. That's coming, but your medical profession is a little bit slow with all of this. But you don't suddenly kind of, feel okay, and suddenly you tip over into having PTSD. There's a spectrum. So with everything, there is a spectrum. And at one end, there is being completely fine and not having any issues whatsoever. And at the other end, there is being a complete wreck and potentially needing to be hospitalized with really severe complex PTSD. So I prefer to think of it in terms of psychological trauma and thinking about the impact of psychological trauma, that we can be on that spectrum. And then by tapping into it, recognizing it, noticing some of the symptoms maybe that we have, some of the behaviors that we may have, going, okay, maybe there's something there. And then thinking about, okay, where can I make a start to try and shift some of this? So trying to think you have to do all of it at once, totally overwhelming. So just picking one or two things. So is it that once a week, I'm going to go and sit in nature somewhere? And maybe twice a week, I'm going to put on a tune I really like and dance around the kitchen. And that's it. So it's just picking literally a couple of things rather than trying to think about doing everything. So I've got a list of resources here. So there are lots of different books, lots of different things to think about. Where I would start, because this is, I mean, like I said, this is a massive, massive topic, but there is a doctor called Gabor Mate that you may have heard of, who's done a huge amount of work with trauma and with just bringing it more into public kind of consciousness. He's just released a new book last week or the week before called The Myth of Normal. But I think in relation to this group, what might be really helpful is thinking about when the body says no. So there's a book called When the Body Says No. That would probably be my starting point. And another book that I recommend to a lot of people is Dr. Chatterjee's book, The 4-Pillar Plan, just because it has a lot of really simple, basic, straightforward lifestyle advice with lots of really simple tips to do. So if it feels kind of really overwhelming, that book there's kind of lots of pictures and big writing that kind of so with my story, which I didn't say at the beginning just because of time, I was very unwell with this a few years ago. So having really simple, straightforward, basic stuff to follow was much easier than reading a really dense book. So other books that you may have heard of is The Body Keeps the Score. That's a more dense book, but amazing. Bruce Perry has co-written a book with Oprah Winfrey called What Happened to You. That's really worth having a look at as well. So just having a little bit of a look, you're going to get all of the slides so you can see. So overwhelmingly, it's just recognizing that this is a normal response to an abnormal event, but it's just persisting a bit longer. That it can cause loads of different things. It's really, really, really common. And this is an area where the medical profession are lagging a bit behind. So just be aware of that you might be more informed and have more understanding than maybe some of the healthcare professionals in your journey.